Somewhere backstage of Everybody Loves Raymond, there was a running joke nobody outside the cast ever heard about. A 90-year-old woman who could outdrink every single person in that room, and did, night after night, with nothing but champagne. That woman was Doris Roberts. And 30 years later, standing inside a museum built around her own memories, Patricia Heaton, now 68, suddenly couldn't get the words out. Her voice cracked, her eyes filled. What came next wasn't about Emmys or ratings. It was about a photograph nobody was ever supposed to see. A final goodbye caught almost by accident, and one quiet lesson Doris left behind that Patricia says she still hasn't stopped carrying. Patricia Heaton was born on March 4th, 1958, in Bay Village, Ohio, the fourth of 5 children in a devoutly Catholic household. Her father, Chuck Heaton, spent over 50 years as a respected sports writer for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a job that kept him traveling and writing under deadline for most of Patricia's childhood. Her mother, also named Patricia, held the family together at home. Then, when Patricia was 12 years old, her mother died suddenly of a brain aneurysm. There was no warning, no illness to prepare for, no long goodbye. One day her mother was simply there, and the next she was not. Heaton has spoken about that loss only in fragments over the years, usually in interviews about motherhood, always with the same careful restraint of someone who learned very early that grief does not ask permission before it arrives. She found her way to performance almost by accident, the way a lot of people do when they are actually running towards something rather than away from it. At Ohio State University, she studied drama, graduating in 1980, and moved to New York City soon after with barely enough money to survive on. She waited tables. She worked briefly as a copy editor at People magazine, spending her days trimming other people's stories about the very kind of fame she hadn't yet found for herself. She studied under the respected acting teacher William Esper, and in 1987 made her Broadway debut in the chorus of a small gospel musical called Don't Get God Started. It was not glamorous work. It barely paid the rent, but she and a handful of fellow students banded together and formed their own off-Broadway company, calling themselves Stage 3, determined to make their own opportunities if nobody else was going to hand them one. Their production of a small play called The Johnstown Vindicator eventually caught the attention of a television casting director, the first real thread that would eventually pull Heaton toward Los Angeles and, though nobody involved could have known it yet, toward a sitcom family that would define the rest of her career. It very nearly worked out completely differently. In the late 1980s, Heaton auditioned for a small, quirky new sitcom about a New York comedian and his friends, reading for the role of his sharp-tongued ex-girlfriend. The part eventually went to a relatively unknown actress named Julia Louis-Dreyfus. The show was Seinfeld. It's the kind of near miss that could derail a person's confidence for years, watching a role you read for become one of the most iconic characters in television history, played by somebody else. Heaton kept working anyway, taking recurring parts on the drama 30-something, then headlining a string of sitcoms that never found their footing. Room for Two, Someone Like Me, Women of the House, each one canceled within a season or two. By the mid-1990s, she had built a decade-long career built almost entirely out of shows nobody remembers. Her personal life in those same years was no less complicated. Her first marriage to Konstantin Yankoglu ended in 1987 and was later annulled by the Catholic Church she'd been raised in. In 1990, she married English actor and director David Hunt, and the two would go on to raise 4 sons together: Samuel, John, Joseph, and Daniel, eventually splitting their time between Los Angeles and Cambridge, England. It was into this life, a mother of young children with a resume full of canceled shows, that an audition notice arrived in 1996 for a new CBS pilot about a sports writer and his overbearing family, a small, almost eerie echo of her own father's 50-year career writing sports for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. The writers would later slip a quiet nod to that overlap into an episode, having Deborah Barone mention a co-worker of her journalist husband's by the name of Chuck Heaton, a private, affectionate wink that only Patricia and the people closest to her would ever fully understand. The role was Deborah Barone, wife to a stand-up comedian turned actor named Ray Romano. The casting process came down to 2 finalists, Heaton and an actress named Jane Sibbett, and by most accounts it was genuinely close. CBS executives leaned toward Sibbett. Ray Romano, reading opposite both women, pushed for Heaton, insisting she felt closer to how he had always pictured Deborah in his head, and the producers eventually sided with him. Romano has joked more than once over the years that Heaton ultimately got the part simply because she was the only actress willing to actually kiss him during the audition, a detail that says less about the audition itself and more about the easy, self-deprecating humor that would define their on-screen chemistry for the next 9 years. Whatever tipped the decision, it turned out to be exactly right. Heaton would go on to earn 7 consecutive Emmy nominations for the role, winning twice in 2000 and 2001, and cementing Deborah Barone as one of the defining wives in American sitcom history. But if Ray Romano gave Heaton her professional partner, it was Doris Roberts, cast as her meddling, overbearing mother-in-law Marie, who gave her something else entirely, an off-screen relationship built on the exact opposite of everything their characters represented on screen. Where Deborah and Marie spent 9 seasons locked in guilt trips and passive-aggressive casseroles, Patricia and Doris built something closer to genuine mentorship. Doris had already lived an entire previous career by the time Raymond began. 20 years on the Broadway stage, a multi-year run on Remington Steele, decades of quietly proving, in an industry that has never been kind to women as they age, that her best work was still ahead of her. She was already past 70 when the show became appointment television, and she never stopped taking acting classes, not because she needed to, but because, as Patricia put it years later, she simply never stopped learning. And she never stopped drinking champagne either. Doris could drink everybody under the table, Patricia has said, every time she tells it. Champagne, that was her drink. That relationship deepened over 9 seasons and 210 episodes, through award wins and family stress alike, through Heaton's own quiet negotiations with sobriety that would eventually define much of her later public life, through the ordinary, accumulating intimacy of spending a decade of your life pretending 5 days a week to be somebody else's difficult daughter-in-law. That relationship deepened over 9 seasons and 210 episodes through award wins and family stress alike, through Heaton's own quiet negotiations with sobriety that would eventually define much of her later public life, through the ordinary, accumulating intimacy of spending a decade of your life pretending, 5 days a week, to be somebody else's difficult daughter-in-law. It also deepened through moments the audience never got to see at all. Twice during the show's run, Heaton became pregnant, at a point in her life when she already had 3 young sons at home and hadn't necessarily planned for more. Since neither pregnancy could realistically be written into Deborah Barone's storyline, the crew improvised, week after week, hiding her with strategically placed furniture, looser wardrobe choices, and camera angles built specifically around concealment. Most viewers never noticed a thing. It was a small, almost absurd secret for a cast and crew to keep together for months at a time, but it was also, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of loyalty that defined how this particular show operated behind the scenes. A family protecting one of its own, long before anyone called it that publicly. When Everybody Loves Raymond finally wrapped its final season in 2005, after Heaton had already won her 2nd Emmy and become, alongside Ray Romano, one of the faces of an entire era of network television, the goodbye hit her harder than almost anyone expected. During the final rehearsal, she became so overwhelmed with emotion that she lost her voice completely, forcing the crew to delay filming the live studio audience finale until it returned. It was not, in other words, the reaction of someone simply closing out a job. It was the reaction of someone who understood, the same way she'd understood at 12 years old, that the people who matter most rarely announce when they're about to leave. 4 years later, Heaton found her second defining role, Frankie Heck, on the ABC sitcom The Middle, which would run for 9 seasons of its own. And in a detail many fans never noticed, Doris Roberts returned in the show's 2nd season in 2010, playing a small guest role as a school teacher, reuniting the 2 actresses on screen once more. This time simply as 2 performers who had genuinely missed working together. It wasn't heavily promoted. It didn't need to be. Anyone who understood what these 2 women had actually built off-camera recognized it instantly for what it was. Proof that whatever bond had formed during those 9 seasons on Raymond had never actually needed a script to keep going. 6 years after that reunion, on April 17, 2016, Doris Roberts died in her sleep at her home in Los Angeles following a stroke at the age of 90. She had quietly battled pulmonary hypertension for years, something most of the public never knew. Heaton later admitted that even though Doris was 90, even though some part of her must have known the day was coming eventually, it was still a shock. She posted a tribute within hours, a photograph of the 2 of them together, captioned simply, "To my beloved Marie, rest in peace," calling Doris her wonderful TV mother-in-law, and admitting in words she rarely used so plainly about anyone that Doris was a consummate professional from whom I learned so much. 1 day later, she posted a second photograph, quieter and far more private, the 2 of them locked in an embrace, captured by longtime set photographer Tom Caltabiano. The caption read, "One last hug." It wasn't staged for any event. It existed only because someone who loved Doris happened to be standing nearby with a camera at exactly the right, and as it turned out, exactly the final moment. A month later, a public memorial was held at the Ambassador Theater in New York, the very same Broadway venue where Doris had once performed decades earlier alongside Maureen Stapleton. It wasn't built for cameras. It was simply people who loved her gathering in the kind of room where she had first made her name to say goodbye the way she would have wanted, with a little theater. A little laughter woven through the grief. Patricia was there. Ray Romano was there. So was actor David Hyde Pierce. Ray, in his own statement, said, "Doris had an energy and a spirit that amazed him, one she brought to everything, whether it was her professional work, her charities, or quietly mentoring a green young comic trying to make it as an actor," meaning, unmistakably, Ray himself. Years earlier, before any of them knew where the story was headed. It's part of why, whenever fans ask if Everybody Loves Raymond will ever be rebooted, the surviving cast gives the same answer without hesitation every single time: no. That 30-year reunion, the same one where Heaton found herself unable to finish a sentence, was full of smaller moments that showed exactly why. Brad Garrett, who played Ray's brother Robert and won 3 Emmys of his own for the role, couldn't attend in person, so the cast played a recorded message from him instead, and Ray Romano, watching it, simply said he owed that man a lot, calling him the best nobody, funnier than this guy. Phil Rosenthal, the show's creator, admitted he had informally snapped roughly 4,000 behind-the-scenes photographs over the years. Most of them, he joked, of himself eating sandwiches, assuming nobody would ever care to look at them again. And the show's longtime photographer, Tom Caltabiano, the same man who would later capture that final hug between Patricia and Doris, told Patricia, after 9.5 years of shooting her, that he finally had something important to say. She braced for a compliment. Instead, he told her, half joking, that she had the worst posture of any actress he'd ever photographed. The room laughed. The same easy, familiar laugh that had always followed this cast around. Proof that even inside grief and nostalgia, this was still a group of people who knew exactly how to needle each other with love. Sitting nearby in the exhibit was a simple metal canister, the prop from one of the show's most beloved farce episodes. A story Rosenthal revealed had actually come from his own life. A set of toaster ovens he once gave the entire cast as Christmas gifts, one of which his own parents quietly returned to the store without ever telling him. 90% of what you saw in that show, Rosenthal said, happened to me, or to Ray, or to one of the other writers. It's why we love it. Peter Boyle, who played Doris's on-screen husband, Frank, had already passed away a decade earlier in 2006, following a private battle with cancer. He chose to keep hidden from most of the cast, confiding instead in Doris herself, who advised him plainly that what he needed wasn't sympathy, but simply more material to keep playing his character. He took her advice and kept working almost to the very end. Between the two losses, the show's cast lost not just colleagues, but as Ray Romano has put it, people who were a major part of the dynamic of everything. You cannot rebuild a show about the unbreakable, occasionally suffocating bond of family around 2 empty chairs at the dinner table and pretend nothing has changed. What Patricia Heaton carries forward instead at 68 isn't a reboot. It's the accumulation of everything those relationships taught her, starting with a 12-year-old girl who learned far too early exactly how quickly the people you love can vanish, and ending decades later in a museum hallway, unable to finish a sentence. Surrounded by photographs of a family that was never quite real and never quite pretend either. That thread runs quietly through nearly every choice she's made since. Raised Catholic in a house that lost its mother far too soon, faith became something Heaton returned to again and again throughout her adult life, not as performance, but as scaffolding, the thing that held steady when everything else felt uncertain. It shaped the causes she chose to speak up for publicly, sometimes at real professional cost, and it shaped more privately the way she approached the hardest decision of her later years. At 60 years old, with a career most people would call secure and a life most people would call comfortable, Heaton made the decision to stop drinking entirely. She has spoken about it plainly since, describing it not as a rock-bottom moment, but as a quiet, deliberate choice, one built around wanting to be fully present, especially for the grandchildren she knew were coming. It is in a strange way the same instinct that shaped her at 12 years old in Bay Village, Ohio, the understanding that presence is never guaranteed, so you had better not waste the presence you're given. She has spent the years since Doris's death continuing to work steadily through 9 seasons of The Middle, through a memoir about motherhood and faith that spoke frankly about losing her own mother so young, through recurring roles that keep bringing her back in front of cameras well into her late 60s, refusing, the same way Doris once refused, to let age quietly usher her toward the exits. And every so often at events like that 30-year reunion, surrounded by old photographs and old friends, the weight of everything she's carried since Bay Village finds its way back to the surface, and for a moment, in front of everyone, the composed, quick-witted woman who spent 9 years perfecting Deborah Barone's exhausted patience simply lets herself cry. Is there someone whose loss taught you the way it taught Patricia Heaton to hold on a little tighter to the people who are still here? Tell us who that was and what they taught you. We read every single comment. If this story moved you, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe for more of the real stories behind your favorite classic shows. And we'll see you in the next one.